From David Zwirner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
Don always said, to see the work, you have to really live with it. Going into a museum and seeing it, for 3 seconds doesn't count. So in essence, Marfa is Don saying, okay, here's the work, here's a chair, just live with it for a while.
So I just found a way to make my own way of speaking and my own way of learning become one stream of language, and so my poem sounds like me so that you don't know I'm trying to say something intelligent.
I'm Lucas Werner, and every episode features a conversation. We're taking artists, writers, philosophers, designers, and musicians, and putting them in conversation with each other to explore what it means to make things today. This episode features the curator Flavin Judd and the writer and poet Eileen Myles. I thought that maybe you guys could just talk a little bit about how you know each other before we dive into anything else. I'm always curious to hear how people meet.
When I was in college, I bought a whole handful of semiotext e-books. And so amongst the Virilio and the Baudrillard and all these French theory people, there was Eileen's book. And so that's the first poetry book I ever bought, and my first introduction to Eileen.
Yeah, I had the really good fortune of having a poetry book that I couldn't get published for years, and Semiotext did it, who had never done a poetry book. So it was like a great weird context, and that was the tendril,
Right, total accident.
But literally, it was just, Marfa is a tiny town, and there tends to be, if you're in town, you go to events and you tend to meet.
And you drink coffee, and that's what happens.
This was something that I kind of wanted to ask about later, but maybe natural moment is, the way Marfa has changed in the public imagination, which is just a fact, and it's not something that necessarily needs to be dwelt on, but I'm just curious, having been there a long time, how you feel about that. I mean, how have you seen it actually change, and how has it changed in the way people are thinking about it, talking about it, interacting with it?
In my case, since I've been there, my whole life, it's kind of like two towns. Underneath, you have the old Marfa and its ranching community, and people have been there for generations. And then there's a layer on top, which is kind of like the Hamptons. And there's 20 different kinds of coffee, but you still can't buy batteries when you need them and stuff like that. So it's a schizophrenic town. But then we have positive things like Eileen and Honey, her dog, moved to town, and it's great.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my long history, which is 5 years, is kind of like New York in a way that New York in 5 years really changed fast. It's sort of like suddenly the thing that used to happen over decades seems to happen really swiftly. And I would say that about what I know of Marfa, which is that, and people always say to me, "Oh, you really, you came in 2014, you didn't see Marfa," but I feel that I've seen, and there was obviously a place that was constructed for me in my imagination where I wanted to go and do a reading and visit. Like all my art world friends were always going to Marfa, and I was like, I want to go to Marfa, and I was waiting for the invitation, and then happily I got it from Lennon, and I was like, oh my God, this is the place. And I did the thing that everybody does, but I actually did it, which was, I'm going to buy a house. And then I think I found supposedly the last cheap house in Marfa, and began to live there. But in those 5 years, it really has.
It's changed more.
There's a hotel. There's a bookstore that moved. There's, just like places have closed. Prices have gone up. The great place where you walk your dog is no longer open to the public because so many assholes have come and invaded the backyard of the people who, kind of take care of the land.
When you got there the first time, what was it? I mean, I've heard that one hears this from different artists, obviously Don, Judd most of all, but what was it about Marfa? You've been all over America that made you think, okay, this is the place, and I'm going to find the last cheap house and buy it. And
I mean, I think for me, a lot of it is there's a number of things, but one is the past presentness of it, because it's like the bank, the library. There's a whole kind of strata of little small town institutions that remind me exactly of where I grew up in Massachusetts in the 50s and 60s. It's sort of like, it's analog on a certain level. And I find it very comforting,
right.
It's just like.
It has a generalness that that it still has. That's the rare thing about Marfa, and that's one of the reasons Don chose it, is that since its economy collapsed right after World War II, it kind of got stuck in the 50s, and it retained all these elements that usually get erased in towns where there's a lot of still economic activity. So it really has this kind of format that little towns all over the country used to have and don't anymore necessarily.
Yes, it's very moving. And then literally for me, it was like I was kind of looking for a place to get away. Like I live in a tiny rent-stable apartment in New York, so it's just like I need space, and there's always, and so I was wanting to find a place where I went to, and the weird combination of like there's a social art life in Marfa, but happily nobody really gives a shit if you go to anything. If you could be there, you could be there for weeks and nobody knows you're in town, so you can both hole up in your space and get work done. And then there's the big landscape and the kind of incredible, I don't know, the romance of the land, which is, to my East Coast eyes, is so far out and so exciting and so not about me that the impersonality makes it a really great place to work. And then the fact that you won't die of loneliness, because I was single when I, first came there, and I was like, okay, I won't freak out here, and yet I can hole up, and that's an amazing.
We'll take care of you. We'll take care of you, Eileen. Yeah.
And it's true.
So
yeah.
the impersonality, I thought, was interesting. That makes it easier for you to work.
Yeah.
Would you say something more? Because of course your personal life comes into your work.
But if you're like, it's like I grew up in Boston. I probably couldn't. There would be a very particular thing I would write in Boston. Even New York is too laden with meaning and resonance.
There's
and
a blankness,
sentimentality. Yeah, and a landscape that really is not yours. That is so not New England. It is so not New York. It's this other scale of existence.
And it's not taking your symbolism.
Right.
It's just not going to accept it.
It's just,
so
everything
it really gives
back.
you space to think about other things. Yeah.
Will you talk a little bit about? I mean, you were there really young, right? I mean, you have early memories of Marfa, early experiences there.
Lots.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, we went there the first time when I was 4 or something. So yeah.
What age did you move there?
Well, we moved in chunks. First, it was Don just rented a really small house within town.
Which my girlfriend now owns.
Yes,
Wow.
probably.
Is that right?
Exactly.
Proud to say. Yeah.
And
Well, she has a name, but we don't have to.
Right.
Yeah.
The house was called the Deanda House. Anyway, and so that was just a summer place, and it was a substitute for Baja California, and we couldn't go to Baja California anymore because you couldn't bring art back and forth, and you couldn't buy property. It was impossible. So Marfa was the Baja substitute.
Did you go to high school in Marfa?
I went to elementary school, but not high school. High school was New York.
Looking back and thinking about Donald Judd writings, volume from 2016, and then this new book, Judd Interviews, do you see that his work shifted in a significant way once Marfa became part of, or the center of his life?
The things that started happening, and it's really, you don't want to attribute the work to circumstances really, but the thing that did change was Don started working on the large scale plywood pieces at around the time that we started going to Marfa, and there might be a connection and there might not, but certainly they came out at the same time as, for instance, moving all the old works into the block and setting up the block so that those pieces could be seen. So.
And what about the outdoor works, the Corten works? Were those happening before? That was also very much.
That's later. The Corten works
Really?
were kind of late 70s and 80s, so that's much later.
Right.
Yeah.
But I imagine that's something that would have been more difficult to pull off without the kind of Marfa environment. Or
Yeah, the Corten is the only
completely.
material. It's the only material that Don actually hired fabricators within walking distance to consistently make.
Right.
And unfortunately, he died before that could keep going. But in a weird way, he was on his second wind, or whatever you want to call it, when he died, because there was really a lot going on. The work was changing a lot, and the architecture was really happening. So,
Right. As an artist for you, was Don someone who was on your radar, obviously pre-Marfa, but in what way was he part of your imagination or inner life as a New York artist, which he also was? I mean, yourself as a New York writer.
I mean, I came to New York in the 70s, and work the kind of work that he was doing in a world that embraces that kind of work was what was kind of happening in New York in the 70s, And so, I didn't quite get it. I just thought, how is this art? I mean, I really was like one of the jokes about Marfa right now is that people who are staying in the hotel say, what is Marfa? What is there to do to Marfa? And they get sent to Chinati, and then they come back and they were like really mad. They were like, I thought it was going to be art, and I have to say I was a little bit like that when I got to New York. And I think Judd's work was just part of what I didn't quite get. And, that changed over the years. But the thing I will say is that the thing that's cool and has been incredible about coming to Marfa is the work actually looks so right there. I would say that a layer of like really relishing the work and understanding it and being excited about it has happened in Marfa by seeing work be outside and it have this kind of changeability and this kind of presentness that is so exciting and real about the work. So in a way, it's sort of like Marfa for me sort of explains what Judd is or was.
Well, Don always said, to see the work, you have to really live with it. It doesn't, going into a museum and seeing it, for 3 seconds doesn't count.
Right.
So in essence, Marfa is Don saying, okay, here's the work, here's a chair, just live with it for a while, come back, go away, come back, go away, come back. It's against the commodification of art. It's against the museumification of art.
Right. I was always curious how Don picked the artists that he really wanted to have sort of permanent presentations in and around Marfa. Chamberlain, in a funny way, when I went to Marfa, I drove through the south. And of course, as you're driving, you see all these sort of car cemeteries along the way, or you see many of them, scrap yards, junk yards. And so when you then arrive there and you see Chamberlain, it sort of really made sense to me as a sort of sculptural practice in that context. Mm-hmm. And Dan Flavin made less sense to me in that context. Like it was harder for me to be in those dark rooms. And so I'm just curious.
Because the context doesn't matter in that sense. What mattered to Don was the radicality of the artists. And in that sense, for instance, Ilya Kabakov is there, who makes no sense aesthetically. He's not a minimalist. Neither is Chamberlain.
Right.
And that's because that doesn't matter. The categories don't matter. The personalities don't matter. It just matters if the work is really good and radical. And in Don's opinion, these were the radical artists. And there were many more, but you just can't use them all. So.
Right. Don is a writer. What is your feeling? I'm sort of curious always with writers, what your feeling about his prose style is, what you're feeling about his general approach is, if you're drawn to it, Eileen, or how do you react to him as a writer?
I think the writing's amazing. I may be more excited about the writing than any of it in a way.
You're excused.
I knew. I was like, as I was arcing with that sentence, I was like, okay, this is my surrealism moment.
Yeah, exactly. We'll have to cut that one out.
Because it's a weird combination of sort of totemic and playful, and it's really careful. And it kind of reminds me of a few things like Warhol's interviews, which I think are so vernacular, and I think that's there. And then Charles Olson, who is so like pronouncing, and Stein, who was like, this is it, So it's just like all those things happen in the writing and interfere with each other in a way that's very beautiful, And I think weirdly, I think there is a projected permanence to it, which is like, wow, really, you believe that, and yet there's a certain kind of awe in seeing a writer. It's like that's where he's a little bit like Stein, saying like, really the balls to say that. That's kind of like impossible. And whether it's true or not, it's like the desire to present this and say this is what I want and this is the thing I imagine is really kind of inspiring.
I was trying to think of like where the intersection of Eileen and Don is, and like, okay, one's language, one's three-dimensional objects, and what is the where is the Venn diagram intersect? And it's Eileen's writing is brutally honest, and it's clear. And I was like, that's exactly what it is. It's in the same way that Don was making art in a certain way because he couldn't contradict anything that he knew or that was known or that was experienced, and he didn't want to add more necessarily. But it was an attempt to be brutally honest and to care about space and time and being in the present. And there are phrases in Eileen's writings that are very specific and small about light and about objects and about people, like the gestures of people. And it's very much about the here and now, and that's exactly what Don's art is about.
I find it's very American writing. you know,
Right,
which is a
right.
very kind of developing vernacular.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely I read it too, and I had the same reaction as you, Flavin, that there's a real directness to both of your writing. Right, it's not mincing words. There's no sort of fear of coming off the wrong way. It's just a sort of stating what you feel about something.
There's no fear.
There's no fear.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Deeply fearless writing,
Yeah.
and I think and real conviction. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and I think that kind of conviction is very
That's not easy to do.
No.
It doesn't. Yeah, it
it's
doesn't.
really hard.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it comes with a kind of redundancy, you know, that is in the work too.
Yes, yes,
It's like
yes, yes.
restating things and
It's
making
practice.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I've a funny comparison too that I have to make is that I am a devotee of 12-step programs,
Mhm.
and they have tomes, you know, like
Right.
Bill W. or somebody, a bunch of people wrote these books that were like, it's sort of like how it works and explaining this institution, which creates a state in which people participate, and then, you know, and it's deeply an American vernacular,
Right,
and I
right,
think
right.
weirdly there's a funny. Nobody's written that piece, and I don't want to write it either. But
Yes, you
nobody's
do.
written the relationship between
Right.
12-step
12-step
writing
program
and
and
Judd
Judd.
tomes. I think I might commission that one.
Yes.
Actually. That'll be
Go
the next
for it.
book in the
Uh-huh.
series.
There you go, Lucas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess speaking about style, I'm curious to hear a little bit how you feel your approach to writing developed. I mean, Don gives a lot of credit to philosophy in many of the interviews
It's very much
in
yes.
there. You know, he talks about his training as a philosopher,
Yes.
the language of philosophers, the kind of real direct.
It's about logic.
Yes,
and
the
the whole
syntactic.
work is based on symbolic logic. Like a book he gave Rainer when she was like 10 years old and couldn't read it at
Right.
all. But it was important to him that, you know, if A, then B, and maybe not C. I mean, this was all like, okay, that's how you think.
Yeah.
And so that's what he applied to everything, and the writing came from that.
And so that's really what I'm asking, sort of if there is a philosophical underpinning to the way you are, and I mean that in the broadest way possible. I would just be curious to hear about that. a
Well,
little.
I bet, though, I have to say, one of the books I've never read or one of the writers I've never read is William James, but I've read Gertrude Stein, and she was his student.
Yeah.
You know, and her whole thing about, I mean, like she was almost a doctor,
Mhm.
you know, and she was like very involved with the circulation of blood in the body, and then she was trying to establish a kind of presentness in language.
Yeah.
And so all her repetition is about that, you know, and her kind of explaining the now and writing being a kind of voice print. And so there was a way, I mean, like I found Gertrude Stein, The Lecture in America, in a used bookstore in Harvard Square when I was in my 20s.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't know what it was. I thought, I sort of somehow thought, Gertrude Stein, Gertrude Lawrence? It was just like, who is this Gertrude? And I bought the book, and it just became important for me. Also because she was doing this kind of like stating her own value, her own genius, and explaining language. And a lot of it was explaining how language changes from the people and from the masses, and from the underclass changes the language. It's not, you know, it's not from the top. You know, so I just early on, there was a philosophy of synthesis and received philosophy. And then by the time I was reading, you know, Warhol's interviews were really important, and his just totally great way of talking, which was very New York school poetry.
Mhm.
So I just found a way to make my own way of speaking and my own way of learning become one stream of language, you know. And so my poem sounds like me, so that you don't know I'm trying to say something intelligent.
Right.
I just am,
That
you know.
that is such an achievement.
Yes. I mean, absolutely. And I have to say, what you're saying about conventions of language is something that I notice in Don's writing too. He's not concerned with conventional syntax, with conventional spelling, even in some cases. I mean, we've left the orthography the same, I think in part to prove that when he says any place, one word, he means any place, one word. Like
Right.
that is what he's whatever he's trying to communicate with that unit,
Yeah.
he is communicating,
Yeah.
you know? And I certainly felt that, one feels that in your writing too. There's less of an interest in kind of meeting the conventional norms of, you know, whatever it is, pronouncement, whatever it is. I think about the sort of I, me. You're not concerned about having the subject always speak of him or her themselves as I, but it can be me or her or what, you know, it's subverting that. And
But I think in both cases, sorry to speak for Eileen, but I think
Go
in
ahead.
both cases, to build oneself up as an individual in kind of in the way that Eileen just mentioned, that is to be against the convention.
you know, at the risk of it becoming too abstract, maybe it's, for me, it might be worth, and maybe you guys agree or not, thinking a little bit about how that happens, because meaning how one crafts a life where a degree of individuality becomes the kind of staple,
Hmm.
because it's not the case for most people. I would say that's a hard state, and how does that, call it strength or whatever it is, develop, or what does it look like in development?
Hmm. I mean, I think just to be is to be a combination of will and luck.
Mm.
Because I think you can want things and imagine things and dream things, and it still doesn't work. And then and yet I think if you have something that and a unique mix, then there's a courage of asserting things, and they will. It's fun. I mean, like when I ran for president in
Yes.
1990.
Can you
Yes,
please
let's talk about
can
that.
you please do that again?
Let's
We
talk about that.
desperately need that.
I just realized this thing about being you could put certain things out in public and you think, okay, this is ludicrous, and you discover that or I've made books like this. Like, I think, how could this book possibly work? And then you quickly find out who it does work for.
Right.
So that when you make yourself public, you become this kind of sticky thing.
Right.
And you see what does
But
adhere
I
to
think
that.
that's exactly. I mean, there are a lot of, for instance, Judd works that he thought up, and then they were made, and then he saw them. So
Mhm.
in his case, it's like some worked and some didn't. He
Right.
didn't know ahead of time. It was
Yeah.
a total jump into the unknown.
Right.
And you have to make all these decisions. And either you make all these decisions, thousands of decisions you make every day, either you're making them or they're made for you. And you just have to figure out which ones are important.
The kind of being deliberate about all those decisions.
It's
Yeah.
paying attention. I mean,
Mhm.
Don's artwork is about paying attention.
That's interesting.
So
And that's probably also when you said presentness a couple times, but that's really what you're talking about in some ways. Is if you really pay attention to something, you are present with the object.
right. I
You're
mean,
like,
one of the things about Don is that his complete, lack of religion and the whole schools of philosophy was that, well, this is all we get, and this is the most amazing thing we'll ever see by far, and the thing that is seemingly so banal to us is actually the most amazing thing we can experience. So we should pay attention to it.
right.
Mhm. I just want to comment on a thing I actually also enjoy about the writing of Judd, and probably something I'm excited about my own. The courage to talk badly in public about
Yeah.
other artists and curators and institutions. It's just like people. I mean, I think especially now. I mean, as a sense that publicly we don't shit talk, because it'll come back to you and it'll take something away. And
Yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite writers, Roberto Bolaño,
Oh,
was
yeah.
really willing to talk about certain icons of Latin American literature and say, "Oh, their work is horrible."
Yeah.
And it's sort of like
But that's so important.
it's so important to have this critical society.
Yeah. You can do it politely, but it's
Uh-huh.
still really important.
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I think that's also where Don is quite good, that he's good at not holding someone accountable for only one specific body. Like, he'll go in and look at a body of work and say, this is bad. This work is bad.
He has definite reasons why work is
Exactly.
bad. Yes.
But it doesn't mean that you're not capable of making something good later, or that, you know what I mean? Like, it's not
Not at all.
It's not totalizing.
And he's also clearly stating many, many, many times it's his own personal opinion, and everybody should have their own.
Yeah.
So
Except he does say in that last interview, I believe I have a perfect eye.
Right.
Whoa, that's
Which I thought was pretty
amazing.
amazing. He said they're talking about investing in art and Chase developing this art investment fund in that last interview. And he's like, but I just have to say, if it were me, it would be successful, but Chase will fail because they're bad at investing money too. They've lost so much money.
Well, he was right, wasn't he?
Exactly. It's like, if I had a little bit of cash 10 years ago, I would have had a great Reinhardt painting. I would have had this, I would have had that. I have a perfect eye. That was pretty incredible.
He's right.
One thing that I like about these last interviews is they start to show another side, I think, to Don than the one that is sort of in the public imagination, which is quite austere. And I'm wondering if I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about that other side from you, whether it's him talking more loosely about whatever. He talks very freely about a lot of things, and I don't think we experience him that way, or most audiences experience him that way.
One of the things you can get, since if you have the misfortune to read the entire book all the way through, one of the things you get
Which
is
you've
he's
done a few times.
Yes, which I've done now a couple of times. One of the things you get is he's constantly asked the same questions
Right.
over and over and over and over again. So that means whatever public is out there, they get the same answers over and over and over again. And I think that's, all you have to do is ask different questions and you'll get different answers. So, but that's what, journalists are as lazy as anybody else, so they ask the same questions. So I'm not surprised that he's, a nice, fuzzy, warm person with lots of different angles. It's normal to me. It's just, okay, maybe news to other people, but
weird question, but since we have you here, what was he like in a kind of interpersonal, in moments of downtime, private? Like, what were those interactions like? I'm guessing saying like, what was he like as a person?
I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah.
He was a normal guy.
Yeah.
Warm, distant.
Let's put it this way. He was very warm, had a really good sense of humor, but very serious about working. And he liked what he liked, and he was not going to waste his time, I don't know, going to openings and stuff like that, because he knew if he didn't like the work, why before.
Right. Is that something, Eileen, that you think about in terms of the persona that is constructed for someone from the outside based on whatever it is, interviews, perceptions, constructions, and the kind of inner life that you perceive in yourself?
Well, I think at a certain point when you start to have a body of work, people start to talk to it all the time, and you happen to be there. It's a weird experience.
Yeah, you just happen to be there. That's a good way.
Yeah. And so I think that is awkward. And then, I think all you can do is try and perform what it is that's actually going on now and not worry about, fulfilling that or feeling compelled to be that.
I mean, what's interesting in your case, of course, is that it's not a secret that, of course, now with, Amazon shows, and there's sort of like there's a whole mainstream kind of whatever, not assumption of whatever you've been doing for a very long time, but a renewed appreciation and a kind of taking on in the mainstream of that. I'm curious. Yeah, I mean, are you happy about that? Are you not? I mean, do you even think about it?
Well, I mean, I think it's cool. I think it's really funny if a young person comes up to you and sort of tells you that they know your work because of a TV show.
Right.
I mean, I feel like that's success as an American poet.
Oh,
I think because
definitely you're one of very few, I would say.
Yeah, no, I mean, because growing up, it's like TV was the most informing art form of my generation. It was just like I grew up in that first generation of television. And that it's evolved as a form means that we can evolve to some extent with it, which I think is, I mean, obviously I think if we want to go to what like when TV came to Marfa, it was a weird collision and one that didn't actually take.
What do you mean by that, when TV came to Marfa?
Well, I mean, shall we talk about
Yes,
I Love Dick? Why not?
Go ahead.
Which I think was so much about Judd, which is really funny. I think that
I just read the book, so
the book, I love the book. I think the book is a masterpiece, and I think one episode of the show was really good, but I think the thing that was so funny was that there was this compulsion to do Judd, out of this male character in the book, Dick. They just thought the only way to do it was to kind of
conflate the two.
Yeah, which was interesting but not successful.
I certainly feel, having not been someone who grew up watching much TV or movies for that matter, that what is being made, there's a lot of bad things being made, but there is also some really interesting stuff being made.
Sure.
And I mean, is that a medium that you pay attention to in your own work or in your sort of creative life?
I mean, I've even written a couple of pilot. I mean, the thing, it's a kind of it's the fact of that world. I mean, I can't help. I'm very excited about the existence of it. Like, of course, I watch shows obsessively. Succession, most recently.
Right,
it's kind of an amazing kind of critique of our moment, and it's funny and it's horrifying and so on. But it's like, but I think that there just is this kind of Dickensian thing where we really have the serial novel occurring on television.
That's exactly right.
I mean, everybody I know, every writer, every artist I know struggles with that. They go through periods where they're reading a lot, and then you go through periods where you're just obsessing on some show, and you're just like, I'm jonesing for it. I'm getting up in the morning and I'm watching that, and it's crazy, And so the result is that I've even, been invited in halfway to that. One of my books got optioned. I became a member of the Writers Guild. I wrote a screenplay. I've written a couple of pilots.
What was Don's? I mean, he talks about it a little bit, but Don's relationship to TV. I mean, was there TV out in Marfa?
It's a good question. This is a really good question. Yeah.
We didn't have a TV until Nixon was getting impeached, and that's when we got a TV.
Huh.
Got it.
Was it because it was bad? Were you one of those households where children are not allowed to watch?
It was just like, it was just like the box that you didn't need. And so we didn't have one.
Did you later become one of those people who couldn't stop watching television?
I watched monster movies after school, like religiously.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know, 3:00 creature feature or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And
Because every kid who was not allowed to watch television.
it became their main drug.
Yeah, I've dated them. It's just
Completely.
like, yeah.
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 Because I wasn't, and I have to say, I never really. I'll
You
watch
missed
it from
it.
time to time, but
You
I
missed
missed
it.
it. Yeah, maybe I missed
Now
it.
there's too much stuff.
Now you just have to just tune it out.
It's weird
Yeah.
now. Yeah.
Well, I think it's weird, but in a funny way, there's so much that you can actually find something that speaks to you.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Typically, like, you can
There's
find
lots
one
out
thing because
there.
there's such a diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much being made that eventually you find something interesting. There's going to be
Yeah.
highbrow stuff, lowbrow stuff. It's
Yeah.
just so much more.
But what's weird, or I can't help thinking of this thought, is that it somehow replaces the city.
Huh.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Because when you
It's-
say that, exactly what you said is the way I felt about New York when I came to
Oh,
it. And I
wow.
still feel to some extent that it's like whatever I want, it's here.
Right.
You know, and I think that people don't necessarily, I don't want to get all generational. I hate that when people
Yeah.
like young people today, because I think there are young people who love the city, you know, but I think that there also is a sense that people turn towards their machine.
I think about this a lot, and I wonder. Ironically, poetry is sort of coming back again
Huge.
hugely, and I think it's
Uh-huh.
in part because, and this sounds silly, that the digestibility of poetry as opposed to long form prose,
Yeah.
meaning it's just easier to interact with a bunch of short poems and feel something immediate and feel it powerfully. And I think, weirdly enough, that this new generation of readers will be real readers and writers of poetry, but maybe less
Uh-huh.
of long form novels, things like that.
Right, and because people are texting and people are
Exactly.
tweeting, and those are like poems. And I think when novels become more like accumulations of smaller things,
Then it
it's
will.
like stylistically we just have to think of different ways to construct.
Yeah.
You know.
What are you working on? What's been occupying you?
Well, I know. I just finished. Well, I won't even talk
Yes.
about it. I just finished giving a talk that made me completely crazy, so I won't. Yeah, I won't talk about that. But I'm writing a new novel. I'm starting a new novel, and the only thing I can say about it is that I want it to be mammoth. I just because I have not read Nausgard, and I feel like I've heard too many, and it's just there's so many works of giant male genius, and I just think I'm really interested in writing a 1,000-page book.
Mhm.
So. Whether I can do that or not, I don't know. But that's my task this year. So I'm sort of not writing. I'm
Other things.
You're
officially
sticking to the Mammoth project.
yeah. I'm officially. I mean, I did it for the first time. I write for different magazines and stuff, and I was offered a little gig the other day, and I tried to turn it over to 3 amazing female sci-fi writers I met in Germany, and said they might like to do this, but I'm taking a year off. And so
Wow.
I said that for the first time, and I'm kind of excited.
All right. So you have
Yeah.
a year to write the Mammoth project.
Well, I figure 3 pages a day. That's
Right.
1,000. That's
I haven't
1,000.
read Nausgard either, so I'm totally
3 pages a day is a high clip, though. I mean, that's like
Yeah, I don't
you
think
write
so.
quickly.
Yeah.
You write pretty
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah. But-
Interesting.
It could be ugly too. So. Yeah.
Well, I look forward to that when it
Yeah.
comes out.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwirner. You can find out more about the artists on this series by going to davidzwirner.com/dialogues. And if you liked what you heard, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It really does help other people discover the show. I'm Lucas Zwirner. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you join us again next time.